Law&Crime, everybody. I'm Jesse Weber, and thanks for joining us on our first trial of the day, the Melanie Eam trial. Let's talk about where we are. This is a case out of Florida. Melanie Eam is charged with the murder of her ex-boyfriend, James Barry. She allegedly stabbed him to death multiple times. He was only 21 years old. Now, the defense is saying that Melanie Eam was there that night, but she didn't do the stabbing, that it was really a man named Guy Hand, the boyfriend of James Barry's mother, that he is the one who did this. And we saw some of that yesterday. We actually saw the testimony of Guy Hand from yesterday, and we're going to play that for you in a minute. Today was interesting because we've seen some DNA analysts on the stand, some DNA evidence, and what the defense really tried to point is that was it not possible that Guy Hand's DNA could also have been on key items of evidence? And I want to talk about this theory right now. And, I don't want to talk by myself, so that's why I have a great guest joining me. Joining me is former prosecutor and criminal defense attorney Nicole DeBorde. Nicole, great to see you, and welcome back here to Law&Crime.
Great. Thanks for having me. Great to see you as well. Now,
I'm curious, this theory, it's always interesting to see, pointing the finger at another individual. Now, we know that Guy Hand was there that night. The defense has said that there might have been a problem between Mr. Hand and James Barry's mother, and that James got involved in this fight, and that's ultimately what led to this. But I don't know if that makes quite sense, because the prosecution is saying that Melanie Eam stabbed James Barry because he broke up with her. But does that make sense? I'm curious these alternative theories and what you make of them.
Sure. I mean, that's the thing that the defense usually has going for it, is that murder almost never makes sense. I mean, there's really never a good reason to go killing another person. And so, as absurd as the alternate explanations might be, so is the idea that she would stab him to death because she was broken up with. So, the defense has to give some reason for the jurors to believe that somebody else is responsible, especially in the face of all of the evidence that the prosecution has in this case.
Nicole, I don't know if you had an opportunity to see this, but one of the big issues in this case is that Melanie Eam allegedly confessed to the crime. But the question became, she wasn't represented at that time, and she was supposed to be. I mean, that becomes the question. She had requested an attorney. The officer said she wasn't in police custody. She hadn't been arrested. She wasn't entitled to an attorney. She confessed and then was arrested. Does that make sense?
It does, and that's oftentimes the techniques that police use. I mean, they say, come on in, you're going to be free to leave as soon as you visit with us and answer some questions that we have. Then the person gives the information that the officers are looking for, and then they arrest them because there's never been, the threat that we're going to put you in handcuffs and then we're going to interrogate you until you tell us what we're expecting to hear. And that's the difference. And that's what the defense has been fighting about in this case, as to whether or not this confession should come in.
Well, the defense wants to say she fled Florida, went to Maryland, to her family's home, because she was so frightened about what happened. Not that she was on the run, she was extradited back from Maryland to Florida for this case. Does that make sense to you?
It does. It makes sense that she would flee if she had just committed a crime. It would also make sense that she is very, very young and would potentially run to her parents' house if something terribly frightening happened. So, I think that the defense is trying to throw out alternate reasons for this very odd behavior, and it'll be interesting to see whether or not the jury buys it.
Speaking about things that are interesting, we saw the testimony from Guy Hand. This is the defense's suspect. They said this man is the one who really killed James Barry, and we saw him testify yesterday. So in case you haven't seen it, take a look. This is Guy Hand.
Night. Besides that, was it just a typical average night?
Yes.
Did you go to bed? Do you remember around what time you went to bed?
Yeah, 11-ish. I'd taken a nap early that day, so I was kind of awake.
Do you remember if, because you'd taken a nap, if you took any medication that night?
Yes, I'd taken a half of a Valium.
And is that something that's prescribed to you?
Yes, it is.
At some point after you've fallen asleep around the 11-ish hour, do you wake up to something unusual? What do you hear?
Yes, I hear screaming, a loud noise, a bang, or something like that.
And when you hear the screaming, where is it coming from?
Outside of our door. I'm not sure at that point, because our door was shut.
When you hear the screaming, do you get out of bed?
Yes, I jump right out of bed, put on a pair of shorts, and I'm open. I exit the room.
Now, is Nicole in the bed with you?
Yes.
And when you are in bed, what are you guys wearing?
I usually sleep in boxers, and that's it. I don't like a t-shirt. And she's got some type of pajamas on or something.
Now, when you wake up, do you see if Nicola also wakes up?
I really don't recall at that point.
Are you closer to the door?
Yes, I'm closer to the door.
What do you do once you hear this noise? You said you put on shorts. What do you do?
I exit the room, and when I open the door, I see Jeff. James's door was open, and I see Jeff, and James is like sitting kind of on the floor, and Jeff is in front of him.
And at that point, do you go closer to James's room?
Yes, I walk in the room, and I ask, what's going on at that point?
Okay. And what do you see?
James slouched on the floor, and Jeff is hollering and dial 911. That's what I see.
And when you see James on the ground, you see he's slouched on the ground. Where is he when you see him slouched on the ground?
He's sitting up, kind of on the ground, leaning against the bed, kind of slouched looking.
And at the time that he's slouched in that area, what do you do when you see him slouched? Do you notice anything about James?
Yes, it wasn't right. He had blood on his shirt when Jeff stood up, and he was like bloody. And Jeff was hollering, "Call 911." And at that time, I wasn't sure if Jeff called 911 or Nicola called 911. I don't know.
But at the point you said Nicola, did she come into the room too?
Oh, yes.
And was she right behind you coming into the room?
Yes.
And when she came into the room, did you hear, I know you said you don't know who called 911, but at some point, could you hear that 911 was being called?
Oh, yes.
Could you hear someone talking to 911?
Yes, I could. Someone was talking to 911, and then I could hear the dispatcher.
All right, so that's Guy Hand. That's the person the defense is saying really killed James Barry. I want to bring back in Nicole DeBorde. Nicole, we can't forget that this is a retrial. The defense tried initially to get at least one juror to say, hey, not guilty. Now, they did get their mistrial, but the mistrial wasn't based upon that. All the jurors wanted to convict her. They all thought she did this. They just couldn't decide what level of culpability. It was either second-degree murder or manslaughter. What do they need to do differently this time around?
I think that this will boil down to a closing argument situation and making sure that the jurors in the case understand the jury charge, because I think your point is excellent. I mean, none of the jurors in the previous case thought that this woman wasn't guilty of the crime. They just couldn't decide how strongly she should ultimately be punished based on the level of the crime she was convicted of. Yeah. So, you know, that's not something to stop a verdict. And the prosecutors in this case need to make sure that these jurors understand that's not the kind of thing that should cause this case to come to impasse.
Yeah, and look, they didn't think Guy Hand, the guy we just played, was the person that did this. Not one of them. Now, this is a very different jury. Maybe there's a different style here. The defense keeps trying to raise reasonable doubt. And speaking of all the witnesses that keep being called onto the stand, with the defense trying to raise reasonable doubt and being told that a new witness is currently on the stand in the Melanie Eam trial. So let's go live into that courtroom right now.
And what you say forensic pathology, and you spoke of autopsies, what's an autopsy?
An autopsy is a medical procedure. It has two parts to it in general. The first part is just examining the person as is. They may be nude, they may be fully clothed, just as they are. And then the second part of the autopsy is where I turn surgical instruments, medical instruments, and I open the person up. I look on the inside and I dissect them. I look for any kind of trauma, anything that's unusual. I try to anticipate, if it's a criminal case, questions that both sides will have for me in a court of law, and also look for trauma, also take samples for drug testing and things like that. But you look on the inside and try to figure out how a person died.
Is one of the things you do as a medical examiner in conjunction with the autopsy try to determine the cause and manner of death?
That's one of my responsibilities. I have an administrative responsibility. Just like when you're born, you get a birth certificate that's filed with the state. When you die, a doctor has to fill out a death certificate to certify your death for the state. So yes.
And in regards to individuals who aren't ill and aren't being cared, as the Palm Beach County medical examiners often called to sign those death certificates if a person isn't ill or under a doctor's care.
Yeah, there's a Florida law that defines what kind of deaths I have legal jurisdiction over.
Okay, so we're going to take a quick break, but when we come back, we'll be live with Ryan Mott, retired forensic pathologist, and we'll learn a little bit more of his role in this trial. Stay tuned here on Law&Crime. Okay, so we're learning about the graphic details of how James Barry was brutally killed. Nicole, we can't forget that the first trial ended, in a mistrial. Some jurors thought second degree, others thought manslaughter. When you're listening to the degree of the wounds here, how do you separate that between those two charges? Because, again, the top charge here is second degree, but the jurors could find her guilty of manslaughter.
Sure. The severity of the wounds doesn't matter a great deal. The only thing that could potentially, in my mind, impact the jurors as to the decision about the lesser or the greater charge would be how many there are and how aggressive these are. It's very clear that she was very, very angry. There were some very, very damaging and deep wounds here, multiple wounds, and that might have an impact, therefore, on the way the jurors think about how she was thinking at the time of this killing.
And we saw yesterday that the actual knife was bent. So that is a lot of force being used there. Let's take a break. When we come back, we'll be live in the courtroom. Stay tuned. Okay, as we go through the wounds sustained by the victim, Nicole, I want to ask you about reasonable doubt, because that seems to be what the defense is trying to say here. Now, if you look at Guy Hand, who we were playing before in relation to Melanie Eam, he is a much bigger individual. And taking that knife, I talked about it with Joseph Scott Morgan from yesterday, and just repeatedly stabbing it and almost bending the knife, that requires a lot of force. If you also talk about the fact that he had the opportunity, he was at the crime scene, and then some other weird details that he took the knife and brought it into the kitchen and then also washed his hands at one point. Some of this seems a little strange. Is this reasonable doubt in your opinion?
I'm not so sure it is. I mean, it's certainly what the defense hopes it is. And, I think it's very interesting timing on the prosecution's part that they've called Guy to the stand right before they called his medical examiner to talk about these horrific wounds, because, I found just watching the previous testimony, Guy to be very, very credible, or to be very credible at a minimum. And this medical examiner now describing these wounds, it paints this very horrific picture. Certainly the defense is hoping these other weird circumstances amount to reasonable doubt. Yeah, well, you're right. It was strategic to call him first. We'll take a break now. When we come back, hopefully we'll be live back in the courtroom. We can learn a little bit more about what happened. We'll be right back. All right, Nicole, I'm with you during the sidebar. Let's break this down right now. What are you gaining the most from the forensic pathologist? You had mentioned something very interesting before, that it was strategic to call him after they called Guy Hand. But from another point of view, what are you gaining from this testimony? You're gaining information about the intensity of the activity. How angry the stabber must have been to accomplish what he or she accomplished. In this case, clearly the prosecution's belief is that they have the right defendant, and that this was a very, very angry woman at the time of his death. And the defensive wounds on James Barry's hands are interesting as well. We'll talk about that in a second. Let's go back live into the courtroom.
And in regards to, and at the very edge, I guess you can see that it's ever so slightly bent. Would that be consistent with hitting the hard area you described as the clavicle and where the rib connect?
Correct. The first stab wound that we discussed.
I have no further questions of Dr. Hampton.
Cross-examination. No questions. Doctor, you may step down. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Honor.
All right, you just heard it right there. That knife was bent because it literally hit that clavicle. I mean, this is just such a brutal crime. Now, Nicole, the defense didn't want to cross-examine the pathologist. Why do you think they didn't want to do that?
I don't think that their defense really has anything to do with the cause of death, and I don't think that they want to spend more time focusing on the severity of these wounds. They're saying, we get it, he died, these wounds are terrible, our client didn't do it.
Now, Nicole, as we were just speaking, the state has officially rested. The jury has exited the courtroom. What's about to happen, you think?
The defense has to make some big decisions right now. You know, one, whether or not to call the defendant, whether she wants to testify, and whether or not they have any witnesses of their own to support these claims that they are presenting as a defense.
You think they should put her on the stand?
Nope, not in a million years.
Well, okay, so if she's saying, though, look, I'm the victim here, I was scared, I ran out, guy hand, why doesn't she just go up there and say it?
You know, and that obviously makes the most sense. You know, if someone really didn't do something, then you would think, and most people do, that they would just get up on the stand and testify.
Nicole, I'm going to have to cut you off right now. I think the defense is making a motion, so let's go live. All right, folks, that's the conclusion of the evidence. The defense will not put forward any witnesses, including the defendant. She will not testify. Nicole, this is a bit strange in the sense that in the first trial, they did the same exact thing. They didn't call any witnesses. I would imagine that their strategy maybe should have been or would have been different.
Well, maybe what the strategy was in a different way was the way that they cross-examined witnesses. And I think that they may have the sense to realize that this is a defendant who really shouldn't be testifying. I mean, she's claiming that she made a false confession already because she could not remain strong enough in the face of questioning to tell the truth. So what makes any of them think that she would be any different on the stand? So I don't blame them for not calling her. And if they don't call witnesses, those witnesses can't be cross-examined, which is a kind of an obvious statement, but it does mitigate risk.
But if I'm sitting on the jury and I keep hearing this idea from the defense that Guy Hand did this, Guy Hand did this, Guy Hand did this, not even saying that somebody else did it, they're specifically saying an individual did it, not calling one witness to show that, not calling one witness to say, hey, Guy Hand said something a little off color afterwards, nothing?
Sure, you know, it's definitely an interesting tactic, and it'll be even more interesting to see whether or not the jurors believe it. It could also be that they just don't have a witness who will say what they want them to say. And, you know, oftentimes courts won't allow witnesses to come and opine about what jurors can make a determination about for themselves. So, in other words, they couldn't really call a witness to say, I didn't believe Guy on the stand. They could, however, call a witness to say, well, you know, I have evidence that's different than what the state has.
I think you and I can both agree that this defense closing better be pretty strong because the life of Melanie Eam is in this defense attorney's hands. We're going to take a break. When we come back, we'll have a lot more to talk about, so stay tuned here on Law and Crime. Welcome back to Law and Crime, everybody. I'm Jesse Weber, and thanks for joining us here. We're covering the Melanie Eam trial, and we just got an update that I want to talk to you about right now. So Melanie Eam has been charged with the murder of James Barry, her ex-boyfriend, 21 years old, violently stabbed to death. And we have just gotten word, and we talked about it before our last break, that the defense has officially, the prosecution rested, the defense rested. The defense did not call any witnesses. They did not, Melanie Eam will not testify. We learned that. And now it's just a matter of jury instructions and closing arguments. So my question right now to our guest, former prosecutor and criminal defense attorney Nicole DeBorde, is, both sides are preparing for their closing arguments, right? This is their last opportunity to convince that jury one way or another. From your perspective, what goes on in an attorney's mind before those closing arguments?
So it's a very stressful time. As an attorney, you feel so responsible for making sure that you are going to highlight every single problematic detail with the prosecution's case, at least if you're the defense. And for the prosecution, you want to make sure that you've highlighted all of the reasons why you have enough evidence to make your case. So each of these attorneys are sitting there just ticking off each of the things they want to make sure they hit in their minds, and making sure that they have them on some kind of a mental list or even on a piece of paper in front of them so that they can get that information in front of that jury one more time.
We talked about it before. It's more on the defense, though, right? Isn't their entire case built upon this closing argument?
It really is, because they didn't call any witnesses, and I can't blame the defense for not calling any witnesses that didn't see a lot of options based on the information that we had for them. So what they want to do is go through all of the reasons why the prosecution's case doesn't make sense, why this small defendant wouldn't be able to cause the type of injuries this medical examiner has described, why it doesn't make any sense that she would have caused that kind of damage right there, and that you have an alternate suspect right there in the house, and how it's possible that the state missed it and got the wrong defendant.
Well, you're talking about reasonable doubt, and I got to tell you, these closing arguments are definitely something that you're going to want to watch. It's going to be interesting one way or another. Now, for all of our viewers who just joining us and didn't see some of the testimony from earlier today, let's play some of it for you. Detective Oliver took the stand, and this was a really interesting piece of evidence because it's interesting to see what happened to Melanie Eam, how she was ultimately apprehended, and it raises some interesting legal arguments. Let's play his testimony right now.
You have no legal training, do you?
I have training in law and criminal law.
So you don't have a Juris Doctor degree, do you?
I do not.
You're not licensed to practice law, are you?
No, sir.
Okay. In your belief, it was a non-custodial interrogation?
Yes, sir.
In other words, in your belief, she was free to leave, correct?
She was free to go anywhere she wanted in that house. She was free to ask us to leave. She was free not to talk.
Is that a yes?
Yes.
And in your training, it's her reasonable understanding of whether she's free to leave, not yours, correct?
Is what a reasonable person would believe.
Her car was towed away prior to this non-custodial questioning?
Is that a statement or question? Sorry.
It's a question. Was her car, I'll correct that. By the way, do you take these questions personally?
Not at all, sir.
Okay. Was her car towed away prior to your questioning her?
Yes, it was.
You think that impacted her subjective feeling of whether she could leave or not?
Objection, speculation.
Sorry.
How many surveillance cars were there on the street in front of the house she was staying in?
I wasn't present when the surveillance was being conducted, so I cannot testify to how many were present.
How many did you release upon your arrival?
When I arrived on scene with Detective Karen, there was one agent present.
Okay. And was this a undercover vehicle or a marked unit that was parked outside that house?
It was an unmarked vehicle.
So it was a Crown Vic with tinted windows, round hubcaps, and one antenna on the top?
One, I don't know what kind of vehicle it was, but it wasn't in front of the agent I relieved was not parked in front of the house. When I met with him, he was down the street, but within eyesight of the house.
So if the house was within his eyesight, he was within the eyesight of the house, correct?
Objection, speculation.
Overruled.
All right, everybody, we're jumping out of there because we're about to go live to a new trial. We're going now to New Jersey, and we're going to be back now in day 4 of the Jeremiah Monell trial, the man who's charged with the murder of his wife, Tara O'Shea Watson, by allegedly stabbing her to death multiple times. We were last live there on Tuesday. Multiple officers testified, as well as neighbors. The murder weapon and bloody clothing and blankets were shown. We're going to go live into that courtroom right now, and new witnesses on the stand. Another interesting case that we're following here on Law and Crime. Nicole, what we're getting a flavor of also from a lot of these witnesses is the fact that Jeremiah Monell was apprehended after a 2-week manhunt. He was finally found, I believe, in some sort of wooded area. My question to you is the fact that the jury now knows there was a manhunt for him and he was apprehended, does that bias their decision making? Does it affect it in any way?
Well, it really should, and the law says that it can. Flight is absolutely something that the jury is allowed to consider as evidence of guilt. And when you hide from the police or run from the police and then hide for a very lengthy period of time, it's something that a jury is absolutely allowed to consider. Yeah, we see kind of the same thing in Melanie Eam, right? She went to Maryland. She had to be extradited back to Florida. Now, the defense is saying in that case, well, she was scared. But here, it's an interesting argument. You don't really hear the defense pointing the finger at another person. They're just saying, well, look at all the evidence, weigh it, and then you'll make your determination. It's an interesting argument to follow. I'll tell you what, let's take I think we have to take a quick break, but when we come back, we can be live in the Jeremiah Monell case. So everyone stay tuned. We'll be back live in this trial out of New Jersey. Stay tuned. Nicole, how surreal is this to watch the son testifying against the father about the murder of his mother? I mean, it's kind of amazing to watch, but you can't help but feel what his life has been like, what he is going through. It's unimaginable. No, it's absolutely devastating testimony for the defense and absolutely heartbreaking for everybody else to have to watch. This has got to be some of the saddest testimony I've seen in a long time. It's just terrible. I mean, how does he even go through life? I mean, I think we heard at the beginning that he might be joining the Army at some point. It's just, you can't even imagine what it's like, and we're getting to the moments when he has to recount what this whole scenario look like, and who better to have the details of what happened, because you have to imagine it's ingrained in his mind. Absolutely. I mean, this is something that I don't think a person can ever recover from. It sounds like he's got some very, very good organized plans for his future, which is wonderful, and some supportive family and friends, which is also wonderful. But what an absolutely terrible thing for anyone to have to go through. Now, we heard a little bit of an objection there about state of mind. I mean, my question is, how would the defense realistically cross-examine this witness? That will be interesting to see. They've got to be very, very careful. I think the questions are going to have to be centered around, if they ask many at all, about what he actually really remembers seeing and how long he may have been in the room, and questions that really relate to being able to gather detailed information in such a traumatic experience. I'm not sure that the defense has much room for cross-examination here at all. I'm going to ask you the million-dollar question. What is going on in the mind of the defendant, Jeremiah Monell? What is he telling, you think, his attorneys about cross-examining, about when that cross-examination occurs? What do you think is going on in his mind watching his son testifying? You know, this individual has had problems with every attorney, it seems, that he's had, with the court process, with fleeing from police. It's really hard to guess what this individual is thinking about just really anything. I think that he is a pretty bold individual who seemed to believe that he could get away with almost anything, and who knows how he's digesting this information. Nicole, you mentioned a good point. He's had some pretty interesting things happening in this courtroom. At one point, he thought he was getting sick. He blamed his attorneys at different points. What do you make of his attitude in this legal process? I'm not sure if we've seen something quite like this. You know, he's telegraphing to everyone that everything that happens in the world is somebody else's fault besides his, including this murder, it sounds like. You know, he's the kind of guy that seems to believe the world is against him and that everything that happens is somebody else's fault. And that's the kind of feel you get when a defendant acts like this in court and with his lawyers and with the judge. Well, I don't think that's going to buy too well in front of a jury, but the bigger question here is his defense. We talked about it earlier in the opening statement. Unlike the Melanie Eam case, they didn't point the finger at anybody else. All they said was to the jury, basically keep an open mind, listen to the evidence. Are you getting the answers that you want? What do you think that they need to do here when they ultimately are handed the case? You know, the defense is going to have to do everything they can to get the jurors to focus on the details of what this crime scene detective is saying. and really stay away from the emotional portion of the trial. I mean, and that's going to be really hard to do with this testimony.
Yeah, that's going to be kind of tough. I mean, I'll ask you the question here. Do they put him on the stand, talk about what happened? If maybe their goal is to try to get a lesser charge here, do they say, hey, a fight ensued, a struggle ensued, it almost sounds like self-defense? Do they put that forward and then say, hey, we're going to put him on the stand?
This is definitely not the kind of client I would want to have testify, but at the end of the day, the lawyer doesn't get to make the decision, and this is the kind of guy that very well might think that he can get up and explain the whole thing away. He is the kind of client and the kind of defendant that thinks they're smarter than everybody in the room.
All right, well, that's something we're going to have to see. I mean, if he really doesn't take his counsel's advice and decides to take the stand. It's a very bizarre case, and if you're just joining us, really, this is quite the moment that we're seeing here. So Jeremiah Monell is charged with the murder of his wife, Tara O'Shea Watson, by allegedly stabbing her to death multiple times. You're going to see in a second that that is one of the murder weapons, just a knife that was ultimately bent from how much force was used. It was alleged that he stabbed her at least 48 times. And what we're seeing right now is his son, the son that he had with Tara O'Shea Watson, on the stand testifying against him, because this son apparently was there at the moment of the murder, and then he discovered his mother's body and went to a neighbor's house and said that his mother was killed by the father. Nicole DeBorde and I are talking about what it's like to see this, and we're getting an update right now that the feed has begun, where the live feed is back in that courtroom. The Jeremiah Monell Jr. is back on the stand, so let's go live. What an image that is, seeing the defendant listening to his son testifying about how he killed his mother. Nicole, I don't know, I have much to say. I'm just curious your reaction about watching all this.
Yeah, no, I'm in the same position. I mean, it's just miserable to have to see this poor young person go through all of these terrible details. I mean, he's describing his life. He's describing the moments before he last saw his mother alive. It's just devastating for the defense. I can't even imagine how they will get over this, quite frankly.
Yeah, and it's devastating for this young man and the family of Tara O'Shea Watson. Nicole, thank you so much for coming on. Appreciate your insight today.
Thanks for having me.
Of course. Now, one of the things we're looking to see is how the defense will ultimately cross-examine this witness if they do. I will be signing off, but Judge Ashley Wilcott is coming on, and she's going to guide you through the next chapter of the Jeremiah Monell case out of New Jersey. So stay tuned here on Law&Crime.